Hello and welcome to the Dark Side. I'm your host, Tabitha Purple. Our co-host, Mr. Storm, will be with us shortly. Today, we will be doing a news edition of the Dark Side. So we will be looking at our favorite stories, or I say favorite stories, but honestly, how can any of this news be the favorite? I don't know. Maybe that's something to think about and consider. The language we use is important, right? And so today we're going to be looking at some news stories that have hit home, and just recapping some of the things that have happened and chatting to you, our wonderful viewers, about stuff before we embark on the last few weeks of the show before the summer break. Woohoo! Summer break is coming. So let's have a look at some of the big stories. First story I wanted to cover is actually about Brexit. Surprise, surprise, a story of Europe. It's out of the UK, and it is really interesting because Brexit has dominated the conversation for many people for a long time, and particularly if you're a person who holds a British passport and lives in Europe, this has been a big conversation, and it's split. The response that you receive outside of the UK is, can you believe it? Is it ridiculous? This is the silliest thing. How could they just up and leave? You can't leave Europe. It's not like you can leave Europe. You can't move the island. And some people are 50-50. Are you going to go back home? And other people are like, you're never going back home, right? Because that's crazy. Like, you vote for that stuff. And so you have this real split about how people receive it. But overall, I think it's really clear and important to say that most people thought this was a disaster. And most people think it was a really negative and wrong move to have made to leave the European Union. Not Europe, of course, you can't move your country, but to leave the European Union, something that they had founded, something that they had actually processed themselves and been a part of setting up, and founding member, etc. Quite a weighty member, actually, a large economy in Europe, and yet still they decided to leave. So, news article from The Guardian, which was published on the 19th of May. The headline is really interesting. They're openly saying Brexit has failed, but one comes next, maybe very dark indeed. And that, my friends, is really the interesting part. When we're talking about Brexit, when we're talking about these things, we're talking about a country that has decided to leave a union that it benefited from, a union that it actually worked with to set up, that it had influence in, that it was a large contributor to, and instead we're leaving it to go and do what exactly? And in a point when the sequence of events that happens next, and of course you can't know that when you're doing it, you can't know. Oh, by the way, what's going to happen after Brexit is going to be Corona, etc. But the sequence of events that happens next, that catalyst, actually lets you know that they were not prepared, and that things were really bad, and that they just were not saying. I'm hoping that I managed to do this, edit the privacy so that the privacy status is correct. Yes, it is. Good, excellent. If you're joining us, then you can do that. All right, let me bring Mr. Storm in now because he's there and I was just doing an introduction. So let's just bring him on. Hi, Mr. Storm, welcome.
What's up?
So I was just looking at the first article, the first news item today, which is that article in The Guardian talking about the fact that everybody openly says that Brexit has failed. And the idea was that the article person, the author himself, Jonathan Friedland, was saying that what comes next is really dark and is actually problematic. And so what he's saying is basically the civil service, the BBC, universities, unions, everything is being blamed for Brexit problems, except Brexit itself, in knowing that Brexit is actually the problem. And on Monday evening on BBC Newsnight, Nigel Farage made a confession that by rights should end the whole debate, which is to say that he said Brexit has failed. Now, he's obviously a big reason in the UK why Brexit actually happened in the first place. He can be very proud of himself. But the whole thing has failed, and instead of admitting a mistake, they go on the offensive of like attacking everyone else. So in light of the fact that they're not going to just be British, apologize, offer a cup of tea and say, can we come back? They're actually going to go through with this foolishness. And their government is really just going gung-ho. What do you envision are some of the problems that we're going to come across now that Britain really have stuck to their guns and are really going downhill with this whole Brexit thing?
Well, I want to push back on the idea that it's British to apologize. It really isn't.
No,
If
it's
it
really
was, if it was, they would have apologized for slavery. And so we'll
not.
leave that one there. I think James O'Brien describes Nigel Farage best when he describes him as a professional heckler. Right? Nigel Farage doesn't actually do anything besides point at other people and try to say you're the problem and make fun of them.
Mm.
But he's never really in a position of power to make any legislative change. And when he was, as a member of the European Parliament, well, clearly we saw that his ability to bring about change and the things that he believed in was so ineffective within that institution that all he could do was say, "Look, we need to get out," while still drawing a pension from them. Might I just add?
Oh, does he really?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. I don't obviously keep up with Nigel Farage. It's not my cup of tea, as they would say. So I didn't know.
No,
Interesting. So he draws a pension from the European Union where he
because
worked.
he was a member of
MEP.
the he was an
He was an
MEP.
MEP.
So he's still drawing a pension from something that essentially he says he wants nothing to do with.
Get the people back their money, innit?
You would think so.
Put your money where your mouth is. But isn't Nigel Farage the one that has German citizenship as well?
I'm not sure if he does. He's ensured his children have it through his wife.
There you go.
But at the very minimum, he would be entitled to it or could apply for it through his wife if he hasn't already done so.
Yeah, so the money where your mouth is a little bit of nonsense, huh?
Right. Look, I foresee a lot of problems. But then I have been saying for how long now that the UK is a fascist state.
Yep, you have. It's true.
And when you look at the legislation that has been passed, when you look at the people that are in government, their policies, I mean, it's just emerged that Suella Braverman tried to use her position to get out of a speeding ticket. Now, this should be an automatic dismissal from her post. She's still in post. That's number one. And they're trying to defend her. But number two, actually, that's criminal. And she should be facing criminal charges.
Because she's not appealing it, right? She's not appealing with it.
No, she's accepted it. She didn't manage to get away with it. But she sought to use her position and influence to circumvent the laws. And that's like misuse of public office or something like that. I'm sure you could try and make that stick, but that's what she sought to do.
Very famous sound.
Yeah. Dude, stop.
Welcome to the dark side, where we are human too and have phone calls in the middle of live streams.
Yeah, listen, you take over for a second.
Okay, you go do that. I will deal with this. Okay, so the basic principle is when we're looking at the UK governments and how they've been handling Brexit, I think it's really fair to say that I don't think that there has been good coverage. I don't think the British people have had good coverage of what's been happening. I think that it's been always heavily weighted. I was listening to one of the news stories this week, which really made me smile, because the news story said, yeah, so what happens is the British, the BBC are being investigated in order to make sure they're giving fair coverage of a situation. And in doing this, what is ironic, or what is hilarious, they want to make sure that they give fair dues to all sides of the arguments. And so they've asked someone to come in, and maybe that's a story that comes up later, but to assess what they're actually doing. So here's my challenge with this. Not all sides of an argument are valid, right? So just because we've got to a point in history where actually people are making up other sides to arguments now. We know when we're fact checking them that these things are not true. And when you look at the Brexit argument, I mean, over and over again, multiple times, you can easily recall that things weren't true. They talked about the amount of money that were going into the NHS. Well, the NHS, they've been depleting the funds. They're refusing to give pay raises, and we know that the nurses are on strike, etc. They put things on buses about having control of their borders. Since Brexit has come into place, actually they have less control of their borders than ever before, and therefore they're having real problems. But would you know that through the general media coverage? And so when people talk about them, we want to make sure we have all sides covered. It was generally given that when the arguments were being put forward for Brexit, that the BBC were having trouble finding the other side of the argument to say it was positive, because actually it wasn't. And so they were getting more and more extreme people on to present this fair media idea of what is the truth. And it makes me worried that actually in the pursuit of this fairness, which I think is not really fair, if somebody's just making up lies and stories and they're building their whole argument off of extremism, then surely it's a given that you shouldn't be watching, or you shouldn't be listening to them in that way and promoting their ideologies when simple fact checks prove them to be wrong. But yet still we engage. And I think there's such a great principle there for us as people, as Christians, as human beings, to actually really think about, what are we engaging with and why? Do we need to give these things a platform? Is it necessary to actually put them forward as an idea? And what is the necessity of that? Because, given that how the coverage of Brexit particularly went, and where we are now with Brexit, it's true that we should never have given people who lied coverage, right? We should not have given the other side of the argument had to have coverage. It's proved itself to be true that they were incorrect, and that they were lying. And yet still the BBC are trying to have an investigation done in order to prove that they are fair with their coverage, and making sure that all sides are represented, even if the representation, even if the side is stupid. Like, why would you represent, like, what? So for me, I feel very conflicted about the whole thing. I think one thing is for sure, for those people who voted against Brexit, we will be suffering the consequences of it for generations to come. And it causes problems on problems. Things that were easy before are no longer easy. The freedom of movement that you had, all of those sorts of things. Every year there is some new restriction or some new way that Brexit impacts your actual ability to even go on holiday or to move and see family and loved ones, etc. So I think, yeah, it's gonna be about it. We're in for a rough ride. That's my interpretation.
The idea of impartiality within the BBC, I was going to say is a myth, but actually it's a lie. I have yet to see, whenever there are issues of anti-Semitism, for them to go and find somebody to come on Newsnight and defend anti-Semitism. And so the idea that you're impartial and that both sides of any argument must be represented is
Only
nonsensical.
applies to certain issues like racism and Brexit. That's basically what it is.
No.
If it's anti-black, then we have to have both sides of the argument. If it's Brexit, then we have to have both sides of the argument. But everything else, no, that's clearly common sense. We don't need both sides of the argument.
And the reality is, to find somebody that would defend anti-Semitism is probably a lot easier than trying to find somebody that would defend Brexit.
Well, that was, I mean, that's what I led with, was talking about the fact that when all of this was beginning to unravel, there were leaked documents talking about how difficult researchers were finding it to find experts who were pro-Brexit, because actually it was, you had to get more and more extremist ideas and ideologies, those kinds of people, to find people who would actually be willing to sit down in national, media and talk about the positivity of Brexit, because people were not willing to put their careers on the line because they knew that it wasn't true. But yet still, in the interest of fair media, supposedly, that's what we were being told, all sides of the arguments had to have fair grounds, even if those arguments were lies, dishonest, etc. It would have been much easier or better, I think, for the viewing public if you'd actually just sat down and said, we can't find good quality people who are educated and who know about these things, who are going to promote this idea. So the only people we have from you is Joe Blogs down the road, who's an extremist. Good luck. Really, that's a better way of saying it. Anyway, maybe it's just me.
Look, I think the reality is we need to recognize that we live in a post-truth society. And I think people are in denial about that. And as much as eras have been defined, the modern era, postmodernism, we're in a post-truth society. And I think that's what this era will be defined by. Because no amount of logic, persuasion, evidence is going to change people's opinions or beliefs. Look, you got flat earthers running amok, and look, even their opinions are being spouted on such, on news programs and things like this. They're being given a platform, and it's nonsensical.
Yeah, it's true. Well, moving from the world of Brexit, the next story that I really wanted to cover is about privatization. Now, it's a UK story again. Sorry for those of you that join in from around the world, hoping that I will cover your country's news. If you want me to do that, you need to send me some news stories. I will look into them with due diligence. But this one I really wanted to cover because it talks about something that I think capitalism consistently touts as the best idea, which is that if we privatize all things, then market forces will force better productivity, better technology, better, all of these things will get better because we are using the market need in order to base the production on. Now, the truth is far different. And I think the people's experiences will tell you that the truth is far different. And so in this case, 20 years ago, there have been documents leaked now that over 20 years ago, there were lots of reports written that the privatization of water in the UK was a bad idea, that it was not only just a bad idea, but that there would be catastrophic problems that would come in the future as a result of this. And so with that in mind, you would think that, of course, what the then Conservative governments would have done would be to say, maybe we shouldn't privatize the water industry. And instead, they use private equity companies to continue to do that. And what has happened is that if you've been following the news with any kind of interest in the UK, from around the world, you will know that you don't get into UK rivers, streams, etc. You don't put yourself in the position to be in their waters because they are dangerous and almost deadly in some areas and quite toxic. And this is because there have been decades of failures to actually properly manage and invest in water and to actually deal with the scale of raw sewage that has been pumped into the water system. And so it's fueling quite a lot of anger, of course. And there are a number of projects across the UK that you can support in order to get clean water in different areas. But what has happened is that the government has promised to triple the funding of pipes and treatment works and infrastructure over the next decade. So again, this is going back to the public purse, because although the idea has been said that when you privatize things, of course, we get much more efficiency, you get efficiency, you get profitability, you have market forces will force the prices down and everything will go well. What's actually happened in reality for many people, and they will know this, is that their river streams have been denigrated over the years. They've had raw sewage leaked into them, water shortages have occurred, and the system is actually falling apart. The pipes are not being replaced at this pace at which they should. And so these documents are proving that this big secret that has been kept, is how they keep saying it, was a situation that could have actually been handled better than it was. And I think it just really goes to show, particularly to the backdrop of many countries in Western countries, where they want to promote how modern and how well developed they are, but we know that they have water problems, the UK being one of them, the USA being another. These problems are ongoing. And when you're looking down on other countries, when you're talking about, oh, but you're a developing nation and you need our help to go sort out your water issues, when you're actually creating the very same problems in your own countries, it should not be shocking. It should not be surprising. And at the same time, every time it happens, you just feel so disappointed that capitalism continues to win this war and continues to put forward this idea that private equity companies can run publicly needed services efficiently, and with the investment that's needed to keep them running safely and for the good of the people. Water is a basic necessity. But, we'll just keep pumping raw sewage into the rivers and streams that run near people's houses. Any comments, Mr. Storm?
Well, I think this is where our viewers from the US can start waving their flags and banners and cheer, because they have won over the UK. No other country in the world has followed the UK's footsteps to a fully privatized water system, and that includes the US. So, well done, US. Clint still don't have water, but well done anyway. I think that we need to address the problem, but I think this is a problem that is not solely one that is contained within the water system. I think this is a problem with capitalism and how it is allowed to express itself, and how there is no real penalties for businesses or leaders of those businesses, those that run it, make the day-to-day decisions. Because what happens is, okay, the company is found to have done wrong. You've polluted a waterway. Well, we'll just fine the company. But in their business model that they're currently operating with, they have built in for those fines, right? So they don't care. They're just like, okay. And what do? They pass on the cost to the customer.
Mm.
And they're not fully investing in the infrastructure. They're not doing it properly. A lot of money is going to dividends. Fine, you want to have a privatized system. Okay, let's have a privatized system. But let's change how we do the fines. Now, my proposal for the fines is any fines levied at a company must come out of the wages and bonuses paid to the CEOs and board members, right? And if you leave that position, that's fine. You're still on the hook for the fine that is levied at the company. You're the one making the decisions. You should bear the responsibility, and not the customers.
Mm.
You do that, and you watch how quickly businesses start getting into order, and not just water companies, all of these businesses. You make the board members and the CEOs personally liable for the fines.
We'll see how quickly everyone gets their stuff together. All right. Suddenly they can all make it work. Suddenly it become more efficient. Yeah, I think it's the lie that we're told about capitalism, and Britain particularly does this well, of telling this lie about capitalism that, you know, I'm of course an economics student, and this is an economics teacher, and so therefore this is, you know, this is my bread and butter in a former life, was teaching economics, teaching business, studying this stuff. And for me, I think it's one of the biggest lies that we continue to tell, is that market forces will do the work that legislation can't do. And the reality is that without legislation, without government oversight, without actually the will of the people being voiced and having their interest at heart, a company whose sole responsibility is to make profit for shareholders will do nothing to look after people. It has no reason to.
I think within the water system in the UK, market forces could never drive any change within business models. And the reason for that is because you are assigned a water
Mhm.
company depending on where you live. You don't get to go and choose a different one.
Nope.
And so even if I was like, okay, this water company is polluting the local waterways, I want a different one. I don't have access to a different one. So the idea or the concept that free market forces could force or drive change within the business model or within businesses themselves is a fallacy.
Yeah.
You're not you don't have that option. So even if you wanted to talk about privatization on the very grounds that actually don't have competition and these water companies don't have competition, you should be against privatization of water companies within the UK.
But it's the same arguments trotted out, because you see within the, let's say, the energy, if you move across, right, to its to its compatriots, to its companion energy, you do have the supposed competition, yet the prices are all fixed. Like, let's all be honest, they're all the same, right? There is no, there is lots of competition apparently, but in the end, you're still not getting that market forces do the because it doesn't work that way. And without legislation to stop all the things that companies will do if they're trying to make, if their whole goal is making a profit, you will end up with these situations. And I think, you know, it's what is a shame is that people aren't putting two and two together quickly enough, because they don't have time, they don't have energy, they're not they don't have the information available to them, they're being abused by the system themselves. And so you're not putting together the water company that's nearest to you, has no competition, it's polluting your rivers, it's not giving you a great service, the price just keeps going up and you don't get anything better for it. So this privatization thing hasn't worked. Something needs to be done. If privatization hasn't worked here, where else has privatization not worked? Now let's look at energy companies. Let's look at telecoms. Let's look at all the things that are necessities in my life that I can't live without. And let's see how privatization of these necessities has benefited me. Oh, it hasn't benefited me. So then what? And I think sadly, you know, people just don't have, they're trying to eat and live and pay the bills, and you're on a treadmill running, that you don't have the time to put those things together and really observe that this whole privatization scam is a scam. It's a scam. But maybe one of our viewers has a different opinion to me. Who knows?
Mm.
Who knows? Maybe they do. I've got one final story that I want to cover today, and which is one that actually, it's inevitable, and I know I shouldn't be surprised and all of those things, but it was actually really heartbreaking. So we've talked a lot about the UK, we'll call it the crisis at the borders. Every country has this terminology surrounding asylum seekers and migration and the movement of people. Now, one of the things to observe is the movement of people is natural, necessary, and is often at the result of varying different crises. And in this case, we're looking specifically at asylum seekers. So those people who have had to flee their country of origin and are claiming asylum in another country for their own safety, because of, could be a natural disaster that their country is no longer safe to live in. Excuse me. Excuse me. daisies, lovely. It could be a natural disaster. It could be as a result of war. It could be in the case, of course, of the withdrawal of the forces in Afghanistan and the turning back to the Taliban. And one of the things that really has made me devastated is to learn that, you know, through all of the tribulations and trials that asylum seekers have to go through in order to have a safe life for them, their families, their children, their grandparents, and whoever else they're with, or just for themselves. You know, you have to go through all of this trauma about actually getting to a place where you can claim asylum. The place that you're claiming asylum often treats you as if you are a second-class citizen and less than. There is all sorts of layers to this conversation that happen across the globe that are really problematic to the way that we treat people who are in need. But this particular story comes out of Liverpool, the UK, and it is talking about the fact that the Home Office staff, so this is those officially employed by the Home Office in the UK, have been allegedly harassing, humiliating, and subjecting the asylum seekers to verbal, emotional, and physical abuse. And this is according to hotel staff that have had asylum seekers living on their properties and seeing the way they're being treated. There's one particularly disturbing story of a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic who was locked in his room and was basically abused. If I see you out here, we're going to kick you, we're going to beat you, we're going to do this. And then his door was repeatedly kicked, so that, you know, the intimidation tactics, if you're doing that to somebody who has paranoid schizophrenia, you're really creating an environment in which that person will eventually break, and it could be life-threatening for them. And so this verbal, physical, psychological, aggressive behavior, power dynamics, all of these things at play. And they were basically, how do you say it when you snitch? In a whistleblowing. They're whistleblowing on the government because, you know, the staff are saying they don't have the facilities to really deal with having the Home Office staff working there abusing the people. They don't have the training even with mental health issues as staff members. You're just hotel staff, right? You're there to just clean rooms and do, you know, provide a nice stay. You're not there to deal with these extremists. But when you see this kind of behavior happening from employees of the government, it's horrible. You know, the fact that there is racist language being used, that the asylum seekers are being put forward. The hotel staff also say that they've denied people water, food. They shout and swear at anyone who requests support, and, you know, it just is frightening to think that people are being subjected to this. And this is what scares me the most about this. If you listen to this story, put down all your preconceptions, your heart would break that there are people who have fled their country, who have been through hell, who are trying to claim asylum, who are living in conditions that are obviously not meant to be lived conditions. You know, people, you know, however many people confined to a room in a hotel with no real facilities to build a life, to actually move on and you know, get jobs and do the things that you want to do as a person. So you're living in substandard conditions in that way. And then you are subject to the abuse of people. Most people would turn on your compassion and go, oh my gosh, this is horrible. What are we going to do? But the world has created an environment which then people's response is not with their compassion, not with the, oh my goodness, we cannot treat people like this. How do we hold our governments to account? How do we make systems and policies that actually help people to have healthy ways of living, to be able to migrate, to be able to claim asylum safely, so that they're able to build a new life for themselves in our countries within safe borders, that we're able to find ways of integrating them to within our society. Instead of doing that, what people often do is, well, they should just go back to their country then if they don't like it here. We have so far removed our compassionate thought, we've so far shut it down, that instead of hearing someone's pain and suffering and being like, my goodness, this is awful, we all need to do something about this, instead we take the side of the bully and we take the side of the abuser, and we want to send people back into their abusive situations. And I think for me, that was the sad thing about reading this story, is I knew how many people, A, would not read the story, would not care, wouldn't bother to even think about this is actually awful and inhumane treatment. They would actually side with the abusers and be like, who cares, send them back to where they came from. You know, they're on the side of the Suella Braverman, just kick them off to some other nation and hope that, you know, they'll die there. Basically, they're someone else's problem. That attitude is so prevalent. And what is that doing to our society? What is that doing to us as human beings as we are being destroyed? So for me, this was it was a difficult story to read. It was really a difficult, you know, these whistleblowers, I should say, these are a number of sources that they have, that were actually given the same story in various settings across. And in this particular case, it was in Liverpool in the UK, where they were talking about the abusive staff from the Home Office. So these are the official workers from the government who are abusing these people. And I just think it's awful.
There's a line from a movie, Remember the Titans, and the guy says, attitude reflects leadership. And so the attitude of the staff is reflective of the leadership of those at the top of the head of the Home Office.
Mm.
So it's not surprising that you're seeing this abuse. Look, as I said, I think I'm going to try and be nice here. I'm going to say that we spoke about the education system and that it was a system of indoctrination, not education. So I think at best I can say that since we're speaking about what's happening in the UK, there's a large portion of the British public that are at best uneducated.
Yeah.
I can't do it. They're just racist. I'm sorry. I tried to be nice. They're just racist. I got to call it what it is. I tried. I'm sorry. They just racist, and they thick, and they knuckle dragging, because the reality is they all be talking about people on small boats coming and taking their houses. No, mate. It's the millionaire with 10 houses that took your house. The person on a small boat doesn't have any house.
Yep.
So, yeah, I ain't trying to hear none of that mess.
Yep. Indeed. Right. Any other news stories that you would like to cover today? Those are my 3.
Yeah, actually, I think there's a big one that has largely gone unrecognized. And that is that Syria is back in the Arab League.
Syria is back in the Arab League. Huh? What now? What do you mean? What Arab? Sorry, hold on. Wait, what now?
So when the war in Syria was happening, they were kicked out of the Arab League. They are now back in it, which should tell you that Bashar has won the war. And of course, they're keeping it quiet because the US were trying to get rid of him, the UK were trying to get rid of him, France were trying to get rid of him, a whole bunch of other countries were trying to get rid of him. But he's won. And who was backing Bashar?
My brain's not switched on, so just
Russia.
Thank you.
Right? So, yeah. And what it's a mess. Like, one of the people that was trying to get rid of Bashar was MBS. I've forgotten his full name. He's the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
Okay. He was one of the ones initially trying to get rid of Bashar, was supporting militants in opposition to Bashar at the beginning, is now welcoming him back into the Arab League. And I think that should give some indication of how the world outside of Europe and outside of the US views what's happening in Russia and the US's and the UK's and Europe's attitudes towards Russia. Right? As I said, it's a massive blow, and there are massive implications to the fact that Bashar has been welcomed back into the Arab League.
Mm.
We're talking about the major oil producers. Syria has oil and gas, so then that means Syrian oil and gas is going to be more easily traded now.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's, as I said, there's lots of massive implications, but effectively the US, UK, and Europe have lost.
Well, there you go. I mean, it says what it says, right?
Right. And since we're talking about Syria, nice little segue. Well, we spoke about Syria and it links to Russia, so this is a segue. Because of Brexit, the UK economy is failing so badly that it is doing worse than Russia's economy, which has a whole bunch of sanctions placed on it.
Oh, good Lord. Brexit, spectacular. That brings us back to our first story of the spectacular failure of Brexit.
Listen, Brexit is the poison that just keeps killing.
It is indeed. It really is. You know, I think what is quite troubling is how outside of the UK, of course, outside of the UK, a lot of people realize that Brexit was the wrong move. Most people will, you know, if you're a British person and you're speaking abroad, a lot of people will be like, oh my goodness, are you okay? You're obviously not planning to go back because that's crazy. That's insane. And still hold that opinion that it was the wrong thing to do or that the economy is doing really badly as a result. But in the UK, as you travel around, and you listen to people speak, there is still this denial in some ways. When you look at what the media is that they're consuming, what access to news stories they have, there's very much the denial that there is actually anything wrong, which I think is just, it's quite interesting. Because even on a basic level, there were buses going around talking about how much, you know, leaving the European Union would save the NHS, and still the Conservative government have managed to run the NHS into the ground deliberately. And are not paying your staff, and there are backlogs everywhere in all of the countries. I mean, what are we saying here? So I think it's really interesting. It's a spectacular failure, and of course that is noted because the world responds differently to the UK and their nonsense. Yay.
Yeah, I think we have a comment here from Crystal.
She said, yeah, what's that about? I was surprised at first, but in the second instance, I actually thought in the grand scheme of things, it makes sense. I assume she is talking about the story of Syria.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, it does make sense. I think what's sad about the kind of the whole discussions around the how we describe it Middle Eastern countries is how self-determination for a nation is not possible. You know, everybody has a resting interest in it. Everybody has something they want to add, say, or do. and there is all sorts of manipulations going on in order to access resources within the region. And instead of just pay the people and let's all move on, right? Instead of just allow people to trade and get on with what they needed to do, everything has to go through the US, which comes to a big story out of the US, actually. Did you see that one? The US looks like it might default on their loans.
Oh yeah, look, but they won't. They won't. They do this every session.
Well,
Every
what's
session.
really sad is they talk about raising the ceiling, which actually means they're just going into more debt, which is actually problematic when you think that really your country, although talking about it's a world leading economy, it's generates blah 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 blah, etc. etc. You're more in debt than any other economy. What are you talking about? Like, how are these two things true at the same time? Capitalism. Anyway,
Capitalism, but also military might.
well, there is that.
Because the reality is, if the US said, "Yeah, well, we're defaulting on our loan, come get your money," what's anybody going to do?
Take back
I
all the
mean,
guns.
essentially, it's just it's the playground bully saying, "Yeah, come get your dinner money back."
I mean, I guess they could just take back all the guns and weapons and everything from them, couldn't they? They're all worth something.
From who?
Repossession. Repossession.
Who's going to take it back?
Well, there is that. No one is going there to do that.
Right. So, look, but as I said, this is something they do every session. Whenever there's a Republican president and a Democratic House, or a Democratic House and a Republican president, um, they always do these things and play these games of brinkmanship. Um, Look, I've said it before, it's a failed state. The state of the economy should tell you it's a failed state. The constant political deadlocks and the inability to get anything done should tell you that it's a failed state. The level of corruption should tell you that it's a failed state. You've got Trump being investigated. There was the Republican congressman,
Mm,
yes, I believe it was a congressman. I've forgotten what his name was, but I mean, they couldn't even vote to kick him out, right? They voted along party lines to kick it to the ethics committee, which is just going to give him a slap on the wrist, if anything, because
yeah.
once again, the Republicans control the ethics committee. So, as I said, the US is a failed state.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Any other news stories for you today?
Trying to think. Not off the top of my head.
Oh, well, should we give our viewers a treat and finish not only on time, but earlier than normal? I don't know. Maybe they'll have some topics for us that we need to cover on our next sessions. The GC is happening now, of course. The G7, sorry. The G7 is happening now. And that will create a lot of stories, I'm sure. I found it just stomach churning. Of course, it's in Hiroshima. And they were talking about the amount of weapons that they were going to be training backwards and forwards. And I just was like, my stomach felt sick.
Actually, there's another story actually that it just reminded me of actually,
I'm good like
in
that.
mentioning Hiroshima.
Hmm.
And that is that Japan is moving towards greater militarization. After the Second World War, the U.S. forced a constitution upon them,
Mm,
but in it they were not allowed to raise military might, and were to be anti-war.
mm,
And over the decades, they have gradually pushed at the boundaries and the limits of that. But as people who remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki are dying, and there's becoming less and less of that living memory within the population. You've seen social attitudes shift towards greater militarization. They're also concerned about the how strong China has become in recent years. And of course, there's the whole history of the Japanese Chinese
Mm, mm, mm.
conflicts. So I think that's something to keep an eye on, um, because I think we're going to see them probably within the next decade push to change their constitution and allow themselves to assemble actual armed forces again.
So
Um,
sad.
yeah, it is. But I can, in some ways, understand why they would want to do it because, I mean, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons on the promise that the US, UK, France, and Russia will protect it. And look what happened to Ukraine, right?
Mm, mm.
Everybody that said they would protect it pretty much abandoned it. Um, so I can understand why they would want to have their own military. Um,
Yeah, I understand it, but I think it's just such a sad indictment of the world, to go from such trauma, um, that we've, with the wars that have happened and what happened, of course, at Hiroshima, to be in a place where you see that they're developing this ideology to move in towards again a militarized state is just so sad. And I understand that while the arguments put forward can be very um logical and sensible, etc., it's awful to think that there would just be more militarized nations. We have enough trouble with the ones that we've got, let alone adding more.
yeah, well, I said I agree with you. I think it's a shame, but in the world as it exists, I can see the necessity of it. I would not trust the U.S. for love nor money.
No,
So
no.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think that's
understandable.
that's the final story that I can give for today that comes to the top of my head.
All right. Well, listen, we, as always, here on the dark side, wish you a really great Sunday or whatever day it is where you are watching. We're thankful that you join with us. If there is a topic that you would like us to cover, do please let us know. We will be returning to more research topics in the coming weeks as we wrap up this season. We hope you've enjoyed it so far, and we're looking forward to our summer break as well. So don't worry, that's coming. We're letting you know in advance that we won't be with you through the summer. But thank you very much for your continued support, and we appreciate your ongoing. Please do like, share, subscribe, and do all the things necessary to help us to continue to have these conversations, to educate, to help you discover, develop, and discuss different issues. All right. Peace out, people. Peace out. Have a good day. You gonna say anything?
Yeah, ditto.
We got ditto today. We're doing well. All right. Peace. Bye.